BBC World Service, it's 6 hours GMT. Welcome to Weekend with Julia Morica. Coming up, more resignations after the US gymnastics sex abuse scandal where team doctor Larry Nassar molested hundreds of athletes.
Today I'm announcing my retirement. This was not an easy decision for my family. You should not jump to any conclusions based upon our decision. I'm not running away from anything.
Why the Iraqi Kurds are feeling let down by their leaders after their dreams of statehood were quashed.
We have bad politicians and they only know weapons. They don't know how to use the politics.
Plus, American artist Jeff Koons' gift to the people of Paris after the deadly terror attacks, but some prominent Parisians don't like it. That's all here on Weekend. First, the world news.
BBC News, hello, I'm Gareth Barlow. The entire board of the US Gymnastics Authority is to resign over its handling of the sex abuse scandal involving the former team doctor Larry Nassar. He was sentenced on Wednesday. Peter Bowes reports.
The US Olympic Committee said unless there was a categorically fresh start with a series of swift reforms, the sport's national governing body will be stripped of its power to run USA gymnastics. Larry Nassar, the former Olympic team doctor, was sentenced to up to 175 years in prison after a court heard days of emotional impact statements from more than 150 people. 5 directors of the 18-member USA Gymnastics Board had already resigned. Now the remaining members will step down.
Several of the richest and most influential men in Saudi Arabia have been released from detention in a luxury hotel in the kingdom after paying large sums of money to the authorities. They were among about 300 held in a major anti-corruption purge in November. Those now freed include Walid al-Ibrahim, the founder of NBC, the first privately owned Arab satellite TV network. Here's Sebastian Usher.
We have been hearing about a number who have been released, but from the original 200 or so who were being held back in November in the Ritz-Carlton, this amazing gilded cage, we know that a substantial amount have come to deals. We know one of the deals from one of the most powerful princes was for around $1 billion. So we aren't talking small change here.
The Canadian aircraft manufacturer Bombardier has won a trade case in the United States, overturning a decision to impose an almost 300% tariff on imports of its C-Series aircraft. Our business correspondent Theo Leggett reports.
On a day when President Trump was telling the global elite gathered in Davos why he would always put America first, this decision came as a big surprise. Boeing had claimed that Bombardier was selling the C-Series in the United States far too cheaply, thanks to subsidies from the Canadian government, and harming its own business as a result. The International Trade Commission had been expected to impose tariffs on imports of the C-Series, dramatically increasing their cost. But all 4 commissioners rejected Boeing's complaint.
The French President Emmanuel Macron has called for tough sanctions against Venezuela after the Supreme Court in Caracas banned opposition parties from taking part as a coalition in presidential elections due in April. Mr. Macron said that for a long time now, Venezuela had not been a democracy, and there was no sign of progress from President Nicolas Maduro's government. The main Syrian opposition group, the High Negotiations Committee, says it won't attend a peace conference hosted by Russia in Sochi next week. Russia's meeting is backed by Iran and Turkey, but Western powers are concerned it would undermine a UN-backed solution to the conflict. World news from the BBC. The US Defense Secretary Jim Mattis has stressed diplomacy over military action in dealing with what he describes as North Korea's reckless provocations. But he said that diplomacy should be backed up by military options, so diplomats could speak from a position of strength. The Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, has told the BBC that he favours less restrictive abortion laws in his country. He said he intends to campaign for the strict abortion laws to be liberalised in a referendum to be held this summer. Here's Chris Page.
The 8th Amendment places the right to life of an unborn child on a par with that of a mother. 35 years after Ireland voted to put the provision into the Constitution, another referendum is due to be held in May or June on whether to remove it. In a BBC interview, the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar said he believed the country's current abortion laws were too restrictive. He indicated he intended to campaign for them to be changed. The exact wording of the referendum question is still being decided. A key issue is to what extent the government would relax the law if people voted to take away the constitutional ban.
In Paris, the authorities are anxiously watching the River Seine as weeks of ceaseless rain have caused it to swell well beyond normal levels. It's expected to rise to a level 6 metres above normal this weekend after one of the wettest Januaries on record in France. Roads along the river have been closed and the famous tour boats that carry tourists along the Seine are tied up. This woman had to flee her home.
In the 4 years I've lived here, twice it is flooded. It's a big deal. I have 2 children. It's traumatizing.
The price of one of Jordan's staple foods is to rise steeply on Saturday. The government is removing the subsidy on flat pita bread, in which some cases will almost double the price. But the last time there was a major bread price rise 2 decades ago, civil unrest then followed. World news from the BBC.
It's 6 minutes past 6 GMT. Welcome to Weekend from the BBC World Service with me, Julian Warwicker. Well, the US Olympic Committee was demanding and now has the resignation of all 18 listed directors of USA Gymnastics following the sentencing this week of longtime team doctor Larry Nassar for sexually assaulting young female gymnasts. Nassar, who was also a former employee of Michigan State University, was given a prison sentence of 40 to 175 years for sexually abusing young women and girls in his care. He carried out the assaults under the guise of medical treatment, and in the course of the sentencing hearing in Michigan, more than 150 accusers recounted their stories. Well, Michigan State University has also faced intense criticism for its handling of abuse allegations, and the university's president, Luann Simon, resigned. Now, 2 days later, athletics director Mark Hollis has announced his retirement following the Nassar sentencing.
Our campus and beyond has been attacked by evil, an individual who broke trust, and so much more. As a campus community, we must do everything we can to ensure that this never happens again, to make sure that any sexual assault never occurs.
Well, our correspondent in Los Angeles is Peter Bowes. Were these resignations voluntary on the board's part, or was there pressure put on them by USA Gymnastics to quit?
Considerable pressure, it seems, was put on them. There was an ultimatum from the US Olympic Committee, and they essentially said that if the members of the board from the USA Gymnastics Board didn't go, that the body would lose its status as the sport's governing body, so it would no longer run gymnastics in the US. And that seemed to have quite an immediate effect, because within hours they released a statement saying that they were all resigning. Now, several of them, 5 in fact, had already gone. They'd resigned over the past few days. This is a board of 18. They've all gone now. The board will be replaced with interim members, and they'll be appointed over the coming months. And they've also had to agree to an independent investigation into the matters that we've been hearing about in court over the last week or so.
Is it clear how much the board collectively knew, or whether individuals on that board knew about what Larry Nassar was doing?
No, it isn't clear at all, and I think that's what any investigation will try to get to. Certainly none of the board members has said that they had overt knowledge of what was happening. In fact, far from it. They say that there was no cover-up of what happened, but clearly questions continue to be asked. There have been demonstrations from students, and certainly the US Olympic Committee believes that there is more to find out on this. This is why they want this independent investigation. This is why they want USA Gymnastics to agree going forward to, as they say, substantially discuss plans for combating abuse, and they want them to, as I say, cooperate with investigators who will look into this in fine detail.
This, of course, isn't the only sport where young children are taking part, or at least starting to take part in sport. Are there others now being looked at where concerns are being expressed?
Yes, I think this will transfer to just about every sport in the United States, and especially those, as you say, involving young children. Certainly there will be investigations. They've already been launched an announcement earlier saying that the House in Washington, House of Representatives, will investigate and look for claims of abuse in other sports. And I think the emotion that we saw last week, and for those involved, you could see it in that court hearing, the victim after victim after victim telling their stories and how clearly it went unnoticed and unknown by the authorities for many a year. This has struck a chord in other sports, and I think they'll be under the microscope as well.
Peter Bowes in Los Angeles. The Czech President Miloš Zeman is taking part in a presidential election runoff against his rival Yuri Drahos. Earlier this month, President Zeman led the first round of voting, but didn't secure enough to win outright. He took 39% of that vote ahead of his nearest rival on 26.3%. Well, President Zeman has become one of the EU's most outspoken opponents of sanctions against Moscow and has also made improving relations with China a priority. He's seeking a second 5-year term, but has stoked controversy with his outspoken views and that pro-Russian stance. Well, the BBC's Rob Cameron is in Prague. Some are depicting this as a contest between a man looking east and a man looking west. Is that how it looks in the Czech Republic?
It's certainly an image that, observers, journalists like myself have struggled with. Obviously, it's something of a simplification, but on the other hand, it really does sum up this election, because the two men have very different views on how the Czech Republic should present itself to the world, to the face of the Czech Republic in the world. And Miloš Zeman, of course, has made these overtures to Russia and China. He's travelled to both Beijing and Moscow. He speaks warmly of these countries. He's criticised EU sanctions against Russia. He invited the Chinese leader to Prague for a lavish state visit that he said would encourage, massive amounts of Chinese investment in the Czech Republic. So far, that hasn't really been forthcoming. But on these issues and many others, he differs from his opponent, Yuri Drahos, who believes that it's time to reassure the Czech Republic's allies in Western Europe, in the EU, in NATO, and to reaffirm the Czech Republic's allegiance as a country very much in the heart of Europe and looking west and not east.
Miloš Zeman had, as I said, a lead of 13% after that first round. Can that realistically be followed and beaten?
Well, he did. You're right, he scored something like 36%, and Mr. Drahos, I think, 20-something. And the though, is that there were several other candidates in that first round, all ranged up against Miloš Zeman, and they've all thrown in their weight behind Mr. Drahos in this second round. So all their votes are up for grabs, and most, it seems, will go to Mr. Drahos. But whether that very popular, especially on issues such as immigration, an issue that was described so aptly, I think, by one foreign journalist as the phantom menace stalking Czech politics. The country has remained largely untouched by the migrant crisis, and yet it's a central theme of this election. All around the country this week, posters went up, not organised by Mr. Zeman, he says, but by friends of Mr. Zeman, an organisation called Friends of Mr. Zeman, and they say, stop immigration, stop Drahos, this land is ours, vote Zeman. So that gives you a sense of the tone of this election.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob. Rob Cameron in Prague. Apologies for the slight break-up on the line during that conversation. You're listening to Weekend from the BBC World Service. After the key role that the Peshmerga Kurdish fighters played in the battle for Mosul in northern Iraq, fighting against the so-called Islamic State, the Kurds felt emboldened, despite international objections. The leadership called for a referendum to separate the northern oil-rich region from the rest of Iraq, and the Kurdish people thought they were finally getting their moment in history, but it was not to be. After voting overwhelmingly for independence, the federal Iraqi government forces stormed the key city of Kirkuk, took control and drove the Kurdish fighters out. Kurds now feel abandoned and betrayed, as the BBC's Shaima Khalil reports from northern Iraq.
Life might be improving in Mosul after the so-called Islamic State were defeated last year, especially for women.
Freedom, it's the most important thing in life now. You can do whatever you want, you can go to wherever you want.
Many things changed for me, especially for studying. We weren't able to study and we weren't able to attend schools.
And there's no doubt that the Kurds played a major role in the defeat of IS in Iraq. But what's life like for them now? The Kurdish people voted overwhelmingly for independence in September last year, but Baghdad's reaction was fierce. The Iraqi military took control of the oil-rich province of Kirkuk, and Kurds across the north are now feeling the pinch. Al-Qala market is the oldest and busiest market in Erbil. Al-Qala means citadel, and the Erbil citadel is just opposite us. This place has such a buzz to it. Someone is calling out as he's selling plastic slippers. There are a lot of people coming and going, but there isn't a lot of buying and selling. Things have slowed down quite significantly. Well, there are two ladies here sitting down with their children. Let's see if they'll talk to us. Assalamu alaikum, marhaba. Tell me how things have changed after the referendum.
Big change for everything. Restaurants, markets, hotels, everything. It's become weak. Business is very weak. Airports had been shut. There's no more people come from other countries.
So, as a mother, how have things become more difficult for you then?
For all people, the living become more difficult for them.
I'm just passing by a shop that sells belts and gun magazines and pictures of people in military gear, but just next to that shop is a shoe shop, and the owner is just shining one of them. Let's go in and try and speak to him, see how business has been. Assalamu alaikum, marhaba. Ana Shaima, كيف الحال؟ تمام? Tell me what business has been like in the last 4 months.
It's very bad now because they closing the airport and the borders, and if we want to travel to another country, we need to travel to Baghdad first, and after that going on to the another countries. After the referendum, we have a neighbor here. He closed his shop because he don't sell in anything, and he closed his shop.
What about you? Are you selling?
It's very bad to me now. Since referendum, I lose 50% of my incoming.
Who do you blame for your situation now, the loss that you've had to endure?
We have bad politicians, and they only know weapons. They don't know how to use the politics. So I hope the politicians to fixing the problems between us.
The Kurdish president Masoud Barzani blames the current crisis on Baghdad's policies.
I said it before, and I will say it again. I don't regret it. I don't regret the vote of 3 million people. The current situation isn't because of the referendum. What is happening now is the result of Baghdad cutting the budget of the Kurdistan people in 2014. Also, the fight against IS came at the expense of development in Kurdistan.
With a struggling economy and a political and military fallout with Baghdad, the future of the once thriving Kurdish region is now uncertain, and independence seems even more distant than it did 12 months ago.
Shamek Khalil in northern Iraq. 250,000 South Sudanese children are at risk of dying if urgent food aid is not delivered to them, the UN Children's Agency UNICEF is warning. The agency's executive director, Henrietta Fore, has been to the troubled country, where she told the BBC that there is a very real threat of famine. Tens of thousands of people have been killed since fighting broke out in the young nation in 2013, and a peace deal signed 2 years later has been violated repeatedly. Our correspondent Anne Soy reports from Juba.
The mark is 11.22.
What does it mean?
The mean the child is severely malnourished.
That's the measurement around Christine Jackson's upper arm. She weighs half as much as she should at 22 months of age, but she's now receiving life-saving treatment at the Al Sabah Children's Hospital in Juba. Her father, Jackson Lepita, is taking care of her.
For me, it is very difficult to bring us very good items to give Christians. Yes, I'm cultivated when the rains rain, when it is reach in February, the amount of Christians are going to harvest. So this Christians should eat.
So you're hoping for some crop in February?
Yes.
But for now, life is difficult. This is a country that has gone through high inflation, coupled with the fact that it is a country at war. And so life is very difficult for many people here, even for Christine's father, who is working putting food on the table, a balanced diet for his children is a struggle. It is estimated that 1 in every 10 children in Juba is malnourished. Outside the capital, the situation is worse. I joined a UN team on a trip to a rebel-controlled area north of the capital. South Sudan's poor infrastructure and a 4-year civil war have forced humanitarian organizations to rely on air transport. Easily thousands of people are gathered here at the Ganiel Food Distribution Center, most of them women and children. Some have walked from far to come for their rations of food. A World Food Program plane arrives, and from its belly, bales of food with orange parachutes drop onto the field nearby, about 100 meters from where we are standing.
He went out to look for these 2 children, and then he was killed while looking for the children.
That's UNICEF's Executive Director, Henrietta Fore, meeting some of the beneficiaries of aid. She says the situation in the country is dire.
We know the answers on how to help the people. So the key is to get humanitarian access to the sites, but also to get immediate funding. With that, we think that we can save the lives of thousands. At stake are about 250,000 children and their lives now in the dry season. So if we can save them, that would be a great gift for the world.
With no end in sight to the fighting, donors will be forced to continue feeding not only the displaced, but also those living in their homes but are unable to farm. And the generation born since independence more than 6 years ago is the biggest loser. Severely malnourished children never fully recover, that is, if they live to adulthood.
Anne Soy reporting from South Sudan. You're listening to Weekend from the BBC World Service. 6:22 GMT. We can catch up on a busy sporting weekend, especially for tennis. And Alistair Ross is here. Alistair.
Yes, thank you, Julian. Simona Halep and Caroline Wozniacki will be taking to the court in the Australian Open tennis final in just over 2 hours' time. Both women are hoping to win their first Grand Slam singles title, and both have lost 2 Slam finals previously. The winner will also take the #1 ranking. Halep, the current #1, says she can't afford to be distracted by trophies and titles.
I was in this position in French Open, so maybe I can make a better match. I can make it more relaxed and taking like a normal match. I don't want to think about the result as I did during this tournament, and it was a great feeling going on court just to fight for the balls, for the games and not for the match, just step by step.
Roger Federer plays Marin Cilic for the men's title on Sunday. In football, Aymeric Laporte was left out of Athletic Club's squad as the Bilbao side drew 1-1 at home to Eibar in Spain. The 23-year-old defender has been heavily linked with an $80 million move to Manchester City. Meanwhile, in England, Jose Mourinho says Alexis Sanchez will bring class and maturity to his Manchester United side. The former Arsenal forward was given the Man of the Match award as he made his United debut in Friday's 4-0 FA Cup win at Yeovil.
There's another one with a little bit more of maturity, with a little bit more of experience. He will bring us also this extra maturity and class. So really pleased with him, and he was keen to play. I knew that was going to be difficult. I knew that was going to be not an easy one for him. But I'm happy with his performance too.
There are 12 more FA Cup matches in England on Saturday, but the big games are in Africa, where the first 2 of the African Nations Championship quarter-finals are taking place. Hosts Morocco go in as the heavy favourites to reach the last 4 when they take on Namibia in the early game in Casablanca, while Zambia face Sudan in Marrakech later. The other 2 quarter-finals are on Sunday. And in cricket, the bidding process has begun at the Indian Premier League's pre-season auction. Some of the world's best players, likes of Faf du Plessis, Mitchell Starc and Quinton de Kock, have reserve prices they're likely to sell for well in excess of $1 million. That auction process is not expected to finish, though, until Sunday night.
Alistair, thank you. Alistair Ross with the sport. In November 2016, a year after the deadly terror attacks in Paris, the American artist Jeff Koons offered a gift to the city to commemorate the tragedy, a huge 12-metre-high sculpture depicting a hand offering a bunch of multicoloured balloon tulips. The problem is that not many Parisians seem to want it. Last week, 24 artists, museum workers, collectors and politicians put their name to a letter deeming Koons' work, and I quote, inappropriate and undemocratic, and architecturally, patrimonially, artistically, financially and technically shocking. One of the signatories is Gabrielle Maubry, a prominent modern art gallery owner in Paris. So what made her sign the letter?
Well, actually, everything that's written in the petition, all the points that were raised in this kind of petition, I agreed with. I mean, the problem is what's been raised is that they say it's not public art, it's private money, it's private art, but it is in a public space. So I think it should have had a call for entries, I don't know if that's the word in English, but that artists could propose different things. Because I think I've worked on public art before, and I had an artist who did the memorial for slavery in Nantes. It took 14 years, but the people who were judging his work are people who were concerned with the subject, which is not the case of the Jeff Koons piece. Like the families of the victims or the associations who are taking care of the victims were not consulted. So the other day somebody said, I showed the image of the Jeff Koons piece on the street. They liked it till I told them what it was about. So for me, it's not a memorial. Like Jeff Koons says, oh, it's a piece for joy. Then it's not a memorial. That's the first point. I think in years to come, it's going to be people making selfies in front of it, and nobody will know ever that it has to do with the victims of the Bataclan and other things. That's one point.
Just before we move on to other things, just on that point, Jeff Koons says he intended the sculpture to be an offering in memory of the victims, and yes, as a symbol of optimism. In other words, it can do both.
No, I'm sorry. First of all, he's not offering, so I'm stopping on that word. He's not offering. He only offered the concept. The rest was paid by private people. The piece was made in Germany, so nobody came into the government or the state. And I said, as a gift, if I give you a gift, and I said, actually, the gift is only the wrapping, I don't think it's a gift. I mean, he says it's a gift, it's a concept, but it's not a gift because the France is paying for it, or private people are paying for it, not just French.
So you don't think the artist's heart is in the right place here? Because he says it is.
I don't think his work is in the right place. I don't think it's a memorial. When we showed it to people, people didn't feel it as a memorial, and the people who should be concerned about what they would like as a memorial, who should have been curators, and I said families and people that they should have been consulted. It was decided between Jeff Koons and the mayor of Paris, which I don't think that's, even if it is not a public art, it is public space.
The mayor of Paris, of course, likes it. She's called it an irrevocable attachment between our capital and the United States. So if she is backing it, it will probably go ahead, won't it?
It can go ahead. It's already made. It depends. Maybe it won't be able to be in that spot if there's enough petitions and something. I mean, I don't think one person should decide anyway, mayor or not. If you look at it and you look at all the memorials you've seen in the world, even the memorial, for World War I doesn't look like that. I mean, it makes sense. It's in England and it's Churchill and, it just has that type of meaning. This doesn't have a meaning for us. If it's about joy, then it's not a memorial.
Gabrielle Maubry speaking to me from Paris. You're listening to Weekend from the BBC World Service. The controversy over gay conversion therapy. And remembering Hugh Masekela, the South African jazz musician who died last week. That's all here on Weekend with me, Julian Morica. Now, a summary of world news.
BBC News with Gareth Barlow. The entire board of the US Gymnastics Authority is to resign over its handling of the sex abuse scandal involving the former team doctor Larry Nassar. The US Olympic Committee had threatened to strip the board of its status as a sports governing body if any of its directors failed to quit. Nassar was jailed for up to 175 years on sex abuse charges. Several of the richest and most influential men in Saudi Arabia have been released after paying large sums of money to the authorities. They were detained in an anti-corruption purge last November. Bombardier, the Canadian aircraft manufacturer, has won a trade case in the United States, overturning a decision to impose an almost 300% tariff on imports of its C-Series aircraft. The U.S. International Trade Commission voted to reject a complaint that Bombardier was selling the planes at below cost price. The French President Emmanuel Macron has called for tough sanctions against Venezuela after the Supreme Court in Caracas banned the main opposition parties from taking part as a coalition in presidential elections due in April. He said that for a long time now, Venezuela had not been a democracy. The Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar has told the BBC he favours less restrictive abortion laws in his country. He intends to campaign for the strict abortion laws to be liberalised in a referendum to be held this summer. The Irish constitution bans abortion in almost all cases. The price of one of Jordan's staple foods is to rise steeply. The government is removing the subsidy on flat pita bread, which in some cases will almost double the price. It's hoped the move will boost the economy, but the last time there was a major bread price rise, civil unrest followed. In Paris, the authorities are anxiously watching the River Seine as weeks of heavy rain have caused it to swell well beyond normal levels. It's expected to peak at 6 metres over the weekend. BBC News.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Morica with Weekend, and coming up, remembering one of the giants of jazz, Hugh Masekela.
I think he was somebody who was able to use both the community following and the South African following that he built up to leverage worldwide attention for some of the injustices that were happening in his country. So he used his time of exile, both in the United States and around Europe, to drum up real support for opposing and for ending apartheid ultimately.
More of that music and those sentiments to come in this half hour. I have two guests with me for the rest of the programme to give their personal perspective on the news and some of the issues we're discussing. Luby Bar is here, a Somali-American writer based in Germany these days, although here in London today. And Peter Newman is here, Professor of Security Studies at King's College London and Director of the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation. Welcome to both of you. Good morning. Luby, I say home is Germany. You have moved around a fair amount during your life. Where has it taken you at various points?
Well, I was born in Paris and lived obviously in Somalia where I'm from, moved to California and did most of my schooling there, and then Boston, and then made my way to Hamburg.
And what took you to Hamburg specifically?
Well, my husband's German, so that was a no-brainer, and I wanted to raise family in Europe and not in America, so I think I made a good choice.
And in terms of recent work and recent writing work, what's keeping you busy just at the moment?
At the moment, I'm still working on the book about my father, a collection of short stories that are interconnected, and doing my reading series, 2 of them, which keep me quite busy as well.
Peter, welcome, and welcome back. What's your current project? A book about Donald Trump's war on terror, I think.
Yeah, I just started working on a book on Donald Trump and how he is going to change how America fights terror. And that is going to keep me preoccupied for the next 12 months.
And maybe a little more.
Maybe.
What so far stands out for you in the difference, if there is one, in the way he is seeking to tackle it?
So there is a bit of a contradiction in the sense that his government is not actually changing so much, but the sort of rhetorical bluster that comes from him in terms of defeating terrorism and killing terrorists and torturing terrorists and killing their families. All of that is, of course, bluster, but it has real effects, and it contradicts actually some of the policies that his soldiers and diplomats and people are trying to carry out on the ground. So it's quite a contradictory policy. But on the ground, not so much has changed yet.
Right. So when you talk about it having an effect, you're talking more about the effect it has on those introducing the policies within the United States rather than those who might be cowed by the language?
Both, I think. So, for example, if Donald Trump talks about Muslim Americans and portrays them as enemies, almost as an other, then it has an effect on perhaps the willingness of Muslim Americans to cooperate with the government, to work with the government, to give tips to the government. And most of the terrorist plots that have existed in America have actually been thwarted because of tips from American Muslim communities. And so in that sense, it does have a real effect on how effective counterterrorism is.
We may return to that theme a little bit later on in the programme. So Luby Barr and Peter Newman with me throughout. If you have any thoughts, by all means drop a message onto the World Service Facebook page. Now, 10 days ago there was a fundraising black tie dinner at one of London's poshest hotels, the Dorchester. So far, so unremarkable. This men-only event was called the President's Club Charity Dinner, held annually, raising money for worthy causes such as the Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, one of the world's leading children's hospitals. It opened with the compere declaring, "Welcome to the most un-PC event of the year." And it then wasn't difficult to see why. For moving among the men were 130 female hostesses, reportedly chosen for their looks. They'd all signed non-disclosure agreements. Their contracts had said that the club couldn't be held liable for any harassment they might face on site. But according to an investigation carried out by the Financial Times newspaper, which made headlines in the UK this week, over the course of several hours, many of those hostesses were harassed and some were propositioned for sex. The Financial Times got the story by sending 2 reporters undercover to work as hostesses. Madison Marriage was one of them, and she told my colleague Julian Marshall what she experienced.
Lewd comments, multiple men asking women to go upstairs with them, lots of women being confused for prostitutes, groping and other forms of sexual harassment.
And what did you and indeed the other hostesses see as being their role at the dinner?
It depends on whether you're an experienced hostess or not. I think if you're an experienced hostess, normally at kind of corporate events, your role is to greet guests, take them to their seats, make sure they're comfortable, get them a drink, top up their glasses if they need refilling. But there were a lot of women there who'd never done hostessing before.
And the dress code that you were given was what?
We were told to bring a pair of black high heels, to wear black underwear, and that we would be given black dresses and black belts to wear on the night.
And you were told that you would be allowed to drink, which is quite unusual.
Yes, and to be completely fair, lots of women saw that as a perk of the job. There are some women who've done this event multiple times in the past and enjoy it and look forward to it. And there are other women who'd never done it before and were appalled.
And you must have got the impression after a while that you were not there simply to perform waitressing or hosting duties, that the men there regarded you in a very different way.
Yeah, one of the women referred to the event as a meat market, which is, towards the later hours of the evening is exactly how it felt.
And some of the women, as you say, were appalled by what had happened. Others said, this is par for the course.
It really depended on who you spoke to. I remember one woman in her break was quite excited because multiple men had made her a job offer. Other women said, it's effing scary. I've never done hostessing work before and I'm never going to do it again.
Did any of the women protest at the behaviour of the men?
I think they're in a difficult position. You're doing a 10-hour shift. The worst of the behaviour was definitely towards the end of the night, so the last 3 or 4 hours. Once you've put in 6 or 7, if you leave halfway through, then you don't get paid. And I know that potentially that doesn't put people in a good light, but for a lot of these women, that is a lot of money.
Madison Marriage of the Financial Times. Well, since the revelations, 2 children's hospitals have said they're handing back money raised at the event. In a statement setting out their decision, Great Ormond Street Charity said,
"We are shocked to hear of the behaviour reported at the President's Club Charitable Trust fundraising dinner. We would never knowingly accept donations raised in this way. We have had no involvement in the organisation of this event, nor attended, and we were never due to receive any money from it. All monies raised in our name go to support vital work. However, due to the wholly unacceptable nature of the event, we are returning previous donations and will no longer accept gifts from the President's Club Charitable Trust.
Well, the President's Club has announced that it's closing down following the allegations, and the UK Charity Commission has launched an investigation. Luby, when you first read about this, what did you think?
Well, I thought men-only charity gala should already raise some red flags, and it didn't fail me to see that it was a woman who had to expose them. But, yeah, it's been going on for 30 years. It's no accident, and I'm glad that it's been brought to light. It's horrendous to hear these stories. And I also think that now that this happened, the offset could be that the whole charity culture will also be hopefully restructured, because it should be more inclusive and really live up to the word charity.
When you say restructured, what do you mean?
Well, I think that these kind of galas, the fact that you have to pay so much money just to attend to raise money to give to people in need, are a bit exclusionist, I should say. Yeah. So, yeah, and also the fact that I'm always quite wary of giving money to charity, because I don't know how many hands it exchanged before it actually gets to the people that need it. I prefer to do it directly, so I think it does just need to be a bit restructured.
Peter, what questions did it raise in your mind?
Well, I was quite shocked that institutions like Great Ormond Street Hospital are now returning the donations. I think there's certainly an ethical dilemma in accepting the money. I think there's also an ethical dilemma in then returning it, because there's an opportunity cost. If a hospital returns £500,000, then that means that perhaps someone who's completely innocent of all of this will not be able to get potentially life-saving treatment. I do think that's an ethical dilemma as well. I don't think they should return the money. They accepted it in good faith. They didn't know that this was a seedy event, and then to deprive people of treatment because of that, I think is not right.
Luby, going back to the point you made about the structure, or restructuring, I think was the word you used. If you're a charity and you are acting in good faith, let's take that as a given in this context, and you want to attract wealthy fundraisers, this is a good way of doing it if it's a perfectly respectable event, surely.
Yes, yeah, I agree. But in the same sense, I just think it should be more inclusive of all. I think that if you're wealthy, you should be able to just help people of need and go to be able to give money to charity without having such a big gala in your honor to be able to do this. It's just...
What of that, Peter?
I mean, in a perfect world, I agree. Unfortunately, I think, having limited experience of fundraising, I know that rich people give money for very different reasons. Sometimes because they're truly dedicated to the charity, sometimes out of vanity, sometimes because, as in this case, for seedy reasons. And I think charities have become very good at playing to the egos of these people. And if it's for a good cause, to an extent, I'm willing to accept that.
As I say, the Charity Commission, specifically in the UK here, is going to look into this. I suppose the other point to raise is how, if you are a willing donor, and Luby, this again goes back to what you were saying a moment ago, how can you best find out to your own satisfaction that the money does go where you want it to go?
Yeah, this is difficult, right? I think the charity has to be transparent in this, but how can that be? I think this is the reason why we should be more transparent, restructure it so people do know where it actually goes. I mean, easier said than done, obviously, but like you were saying, that they also play a game, the charities, to be able to attract these wealthy donors, and maybe perhaps that they can't be so transparent in what they're doing.
6:44 GMT. Another ethical question for you to consider now. How easy is it to be both gay and Christian in the 21st century? The answer to that question will depend both on the country that you live in and the church that you're a member of. Gay conversion therapy, sometimes referred to as pray the gay away, aims to stop people from acting on feelings of same-sex attraction. Well, here in Britain, the Church of England's governing body voted to ban the practice last year, but it does still go on behind closed doors. Tim Smith visited Oasis Church, Waterloo in London, a place that welcomes LGBTQ worshippers just as a service was going on.
absolutely as welcome as everybody arrived before.
After the service, I met Joe, who not all that long ago came out to his former church as gay. They advised him to attend a programme that they said would help him change his behaviour.
It was the first time I sat in the room with other people where they'd had the same experience as me, but fairly quickly I realised these guys just looked like their life had been sapped out of them because they were consumed with this battle of fighting, looked like they were lying to themselves about the fact that at some point along the line you have to admit that you are gay.
What kind of techniques, practices, teachings was it that they used?
It was a place where they were trying to manage your sexuality to a point where you wouldn't really embrace your gay identity or act out on those feelings, really.
Did you yourself believe it to be a kind of a sinful, shameful side of you?
I believed that I needed to keep my sexuality under control, and the best thing for me would be to stay celibate, and this was a place that would support me in doing so, basically.
Gay conversion therapy, like our wider attitude to homosexuality in Britain, has changed in recent decades.
Most homosexuals dread getting old, dread losing their looks, fear in particular the final loneliness of living without a companion.
At the time when this 1967 BBC documentary on the gay experience was made, electric shock therapy was still being used to try and rid people of same-sex attraction.
They might almost be a married couple, but they're still queer, in the minority.
But while British society is now more tolerant to same-sex relationships, gay conversion does still go on behind closed doors. One of the few people practicing openly is Mike Davidson from Core Issues Trust. Change-orientated therapy is his preferred term, and he uses a mix of talking therapy, role-playing and prayer to help gay people to try and live a straight or celibate life.
The issue is they're not happy, and once the basis of that has been worked through, if they're still unhappy and they want to move in a different direction, I believe that needs to be taken seriously, and they need to be offered professional support to do that.
What do you say to the fact that there are a large number of people who undergo gay conversion therapy who feel afterwards that they have been damaged and that it has been entirely at odds with how they feel in themselves?
Show us the evidence, show us the peer-reviewed journal articles or research projects that indicate that on average this therapeutic intervention is harmful.
So why is there a lack of hard scientific evidence? Professor Michael King is from University College London and has been studying the effects of gay conversion therapy for more than 20 years.
It's really interesting that there's never been a very good clinical trial. I think it's dangerous for people's psychological health, for their morale. So the premise is that homosexuality is a disorder that needs changing, and therefore you give the treatment to do that. Now that's a very old-fashioned concept that was really left behind in the 70s. Homosexuality has not been regarded as a disorder. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. So it's unethical and an infringement of human rights to treat something that's not a disorder.
Professor Michael King ending that report by Tim Smith. Peter Newman, what do you take out of that?
Well, I think the professor really summed it up. It's unethical and it is psychologically damaging to people. At the same time, you have to recognize how really profoundly social norms have changed on this particular issue over the past 20 or 30 years. I remember when I went to school, people were talking about this and it was still considered to be something fairly normal. To have this kind of therapy and to feel unhappy about you being gay. It was fairly normal for people, even in Western countries, to say that this is abnormal, this is a disorder, and that has really profoundly changed over the last 20, 30 years.
Not, though, universally, Luby.
Yeah, obviously no, not universally, but I agree with what Peter was saying and also that professor. I think it just can have, I don't know if it actually has been proven that it worked, and it can have some serious damaging side effects, not only for the person, but all the families around. I still can't believe that this is a discussion we have to have in 2017. But yeah, I'm glad that people are speaking up against it.
I mean, the reason I highlighted the universal nature to it was that in the introduction I said the answer to the question I posed about being gay and Christian will depend on the country you live in, and that is clearly still so true.
Yes, absolutely. And in a way, of course, people are conflicted. If you're gay and Christian, you feel unhappy about being gay because the Christian part of yourself says you shouldn't be gay. But once you then go through the therapy, you perhaps feel even more unhappy because, you know, they are trying to change something that is really fundamental to your identity. So it is a real dilemma for the people involved.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Morica with Weekend. A reminder of the main news. The entire board of US Gymnastics is quitting in response to the scandal surrounding the sexual abuse of young athletes. You'll hear more on that after the main news. The authorities in Saudi Arabia have freed some of the kingdom's richest and most influential men from the hotel where they'd been detained in an anti-corruption purge. The Canadian aircraft maker Bombardier has won a major legal victory over its US competitor, Boeing. And President Macron of France has called for tougher sanctions against Venezuela, alleging that the country is not a democracy. Now, last week, the legendary jazz trumpeter Hugh Masekela died at the age of 78. The father of South African jazz was a leading figure in the struggle to end apartheid in South Africa. Masekela gained global recognition with his distinctive Afro-jazz sound and hits such as Soweto Blues. In a statement, the South African President, Jacob Zuma, said Masekela's death was an immeasurable loss to the music industry and to the country at large. Zuma continued, his contribution to the struggle for liberation will never be forgotten. Well, speaking to the BBC in 2007, Hugh Masekela described how music dominated his childhood.
I was kidnapped by music. When I used to listen to the gramophone, I thought there were little people living inside the speakers. But then I was surrounded by music, you know. I grew up in a town that had migrant laborers from all over southern and central Africa and the hinterland of South Africa. On weekends, they would exhibit to each other and for themselves dances and songs of heritage. It would be pageantry. A song always rang in my ear.
Hugh Masekela's friend and collaborator, Soweto Kinch, presents Jazz Now on BBC Radio 3, and we asked him to reflect on Hugh Masekela's life and music.
Hugh Masekela is an incredible trumpeter, flugelhorn player, composer and bandleader. Who arose out of South Africa and really is credited with fathering a new style of jazz, township jazz, African jazz. And for me was hugely influential in as much as he managed to encapsulate his identity in the music that he played and also transformed the perceptions of a country around the world really forever. I think he was somebody who was able to use both the community following and the South African following that he built up to leverage worldwide attention for some of the injustices that were happening in his country. So he used his time of exile in the United States and around Europe to drum up real support for opposing and for ending apartheid ultimately. And of course he was connected to the hundreds, if not thousands, of exiles who were also, you know, fleeing South African persecution in times of apartheid. You could still see in the shows that I managed to play with him, queues of people lining up after each show, just to shake his hand, just to meet him and to thank him for what his music meant to them. So a song like Stimela, Steam Engine, it was a song that really evoked a particular story of African people being bussed out of the centre of town, being kicked out of Sophia Town and sent to townships. So this is a song which is intrinsically political, just in the sound alone, let alone the lyrics. In addition to Stimela, and a song which I think encapsulates the feel and the time excellently, Soweto Blues and Bring Him Back Home particularly became anthems for the anti-apartheid movement. For anybody who was involved in, you know, really publicizing the ills of apartheid, to have a song like Bring Him Back Home, which of course referred specifically to Nelson Mandela in 1987, that really started to reframe the whole discussion of, is the ANC a terrorist organization? Is Nelson Mandela really a terrorist, or is he a freedom fighter? And with Bring Him Back Home, I think it emphatically, you know, became an anthem really to release Nelson Mandela and to bring about the collapse and the end of apartheid. It was incredible to play alongside Hugh Masekela. I was lucky enough to be a guest artist along with a great French pianist, Yaron Herman. But the great thing about it was how welcome both he and all the musicians on his stage made me feel. It's not always the case with elder statesmen musicians that they're so encouraging of a new generation of jazz musician. And he also made a fuss about my musicianship, my playing, but of course my name, and how confused he was that there's this English guy called Soweto. And that obviously got vast chuckles from the audience. But I always felt a warm embrace and a warm encouragement from Hugh, and somebody that really encouraged me to both explore the history of jazz and to find myself within it.
That was Soweto Kinch of BBC Radio 3's Jazz Now, friend and collaborator of Hugh Masekela, who has died at the age of 78. I was struck, Luby, and I wondered from a writer's point of view, when you hear a man like Hugh Masekela describe how he got into music and uses that phrase kidnapped by music as a child.
That's exactly what grabbed my attention as well. I think he aptly summed up what music does. It's one of the only mediums that can really encapsulate you in such a direct and affecting way. Unfortunately, I didn't know much of his music, but by all accounts, he was an amazing musician, and a musician that's also an activist. I think has a very special part in people's hearts, especially in a country like South Africa. But he seems like to be quite a writer and a phenomenal musician.
I mean, the word kidnapped clearly says, you know, once it's got you, you can't escape it. I wonder, from your point of view as a writer, is that how you felt about the art that you've ended up following?
Yeah, I was kidnapped precisely by the English language. It was one of my third languages that I learned, and happily so. Yeah, like I said, he really got it. Kidnapped in the best sense of the word, you know. Yeah.
Peter, is it music of your particular taste, or?
To be honest, no. But I find the sound incredibly intriguing, and it's sad that sometimes your attention is only drawn to people when they die. But I will definitely go out there and listen to some of the music now.
And it's a classic example, isn't it, of somebody who not only was a brilliant musician, but because of where he came from and what was happening in that country at the time, and the fight that he became a part of, that naturally the following is much, much greater.
Absolutely. It's the sound that is intriguing, but it's also there is a story and there is a narrative that is connected to the sound, and it becomes so much more intriguing if you imagine Soweto, if you imagine everything that happened in the 1980s in South Africa. It's almost playing out in your mind, and to have the sound with it makes it something that you want to explore.
Well, let's explore it for a few more seconds. More music here from Hugh Masekela.